Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our sixth national debate on resilience in the water sector on what should regulation of the water sector look like. It's fantastic to see so many of you online with plenty of people joining all of the time. And before I hand over to the chair for this afternoon's event, Dr. Heather Smith, I wanted just to provide a short introduction to the origins of the debate, where they came from, and why this particular topic we think is important to us, and then a little bit about how the debate will run. So across the universities of Cranfield, Sheffield and Newcastle, we host an EPSRC funded research doctoral centre on water infrastructure and resilience, which we term WIRe. This collaborative programme has trained over 70 PhD students. It's a collaboration between academia and industry, and we're looking to train a further 40 PhD students over the next 4 years, with the aim of producing really high quality graduates with the technical and management skills to make a real difference in the water sector. In making the case for the programme, we had to highlight the issues and challenges facing the water sector. So understanding the complexity of some of these challenges, including the regulatory side and the governance side, was really key to us being successful. And so for the last few years, we've brought together experts in the field on various different topics related to water and water management, who can really inform on the discussion and the debate. So I'm very pleased that this year we're tackling a really important matter in relation to water management in the UK with respect to the regulation of water. And there's a real lot of current discussion amongst policymakers, other stakeholders, important stakeholders, particularly in light of the recommendations from the recent Cunliffe report, which I'm sure is going to be referred to this afternoon. So we've kind of posed some interesting questions for the discussion this afternoon around what the perfect regulator should look like, how we should establish innovative governance in the sector, and then does regulation act as a driver for growth, or is it more of a constraint? So we've got a really great agenda of talks from experts, followed by the discussion, the debate itself. We've also included some of our students so that we've got that student voice in the discussion, which we felt was really important. So throughout the afternoon, we do want to hear from you as well as the audience participants. So please post your questions, your comments, discussion points as we go through using the chat function in Teams, please. During the first talks, there will be no kind of opportunity for a Q&A, so please do save those questions for the discussion part of the session. Okay, so without further ado then, I would like to hand over to our conference chair for the afternoon. So unlike me, she is an expert in policy and governance matters related to water. So I'm very pleased to introduce Dr. Heather Smith, who is Senior Lecturer in Water Governance at Cranfield in the Cranfield Water Science Institute. So in her role at Cranfield, she explores the governance, the institutions, the societal dimensions associated with water and wastewater services. And she's particularly interested in the relationship between governance and resilience. So there's no sort of better person that would be able to host and chair this debate than Heather. So I'm going to pass over to Heather for a few words.
Thanks very much. I'm really excited to be here to be able to chair the session today. As Pete said, this is a topic that's quite close to my heart. I've been working in researching and exploring the governance of the water sector in this country for quite a few years now. And it's fair to say, I think we find ourselves in quite a turbulent and interesting time. There's a lot of change in the air. Pete mentioned the outcome of the Independent Water Commission, or the Cunliffe report, which really acted as a bit of a watershed moment in signalling a lot of change that's needed in the regulation of the sector. Since then, we've also had the DEFRA white paper, and there was the announcement of new legislation in the King's Speech. So as we await that, there's a lot of discussion that's happening about what kind of new regulation or new types of legislation we need to see. We already know we're going to see a new regulator, and there's a lot of discussion going on about what that's going to look like. So it's an opportune moment to explore some of these issues. And to help us do that, we have 4 great speakers who are going to talk through some of the wildly interesting things that are coming out and give us a lot of interesting perspectives. And after that, we'll settle into a discussion. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our first speaker, who is Paul Leinster, Professor Paul Leinster, who has an extensive career in the water sector. And he used to be the chair of the Environment Agency and is currently the chair of Water Resources East and the Bedford Water Partnership. I won't read his full biography because it's extensive, but you can access that online. So Paul, I want you to give us your speech. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Heather. And I think for extensive, you can substitute old. I think that so the older we get, the more experienced allegedly you are. So if we could have the first slide, please. And then that's just an introduction. That's who I am. So if we go on to the second slide, please. So just to start, and understanding, especially around water resources, and considering what regulatory approach should be taken with water resources, drought is a natural event, and established drought conditions, as we say, take time to develop. So in the Environment Agency and in water resources, often what we're really concerned about is 2 dry winters. With the winters being the refill periods for some of the major reservoirs. But there are 3 main types. An agricultural drought is usually the first one to appear, especially for rain-fed crops. And that's going to impact on crop production. You just need a dry period, and then the farmers will be suffering, in particular with some of their crops. Then there's environmental droughts, in which we see reduced river flows. We'll see potential impacts on fish and on habitats. And it's normal then to restrict abstractions from rivers and groundwater. And then there's a water supply drought, and that's all to do with the resilience of the public water supply, which has improved over the years. Next slide, please. And the real challenge is ensuring that there's the right balance of sufficient water of the right quality for people, agriculture, businesses, and the environment. And everybody wants their share when water is in short supply. And so the impacts of both water quality and water resources can be quite localized and of defined periods. And in the UK, the availability of water for the environment and agriculture depends on the resilience of the public water supply, because the public water supply takes precedence in times of water stress. Next slide, please. But I also wanted to have a look at what the pressures are on water resources and water quality, and thought I'd use the example of the Great Ouse, which is close to where Cranfield is. On this map, you see a map of the Upper and Bedford Ouse catchment, and so you've got Milton Keynes to the left, Bedford in the middle, Huntingdon up at the top of this, and then just below St Neots you've got a place called Tempsford. So in terms of growth, which then puts a pressure onto both water resources and also onto water quality, Milton Keynes has its local plan, but it's a potential area for one of the new towns. So that's a new town on top of the new city, with potentially 40,000 more homes going there than are within the local plan. Bedford in the centre is growing at twice the national average. And then you see the purple circle there for Universal Studios. And that came in not within the local planning process, but a planning process which went through Parliament. And so that need wasn't identified locally until the decision was announced that this is where Universal was going to go. It has clearly water resource needs and also wastewater treatment needs. The next one along, which is unnamed, which is Tempsford, that's potentially another town of at least 40,000 people, 40,000 homes. So that'd be about 100,000 people. And then we've got growth areas in Huntingdon and Biggleswade as well. So on this river system, you see significant water resource challenges. The brown arrows indicate where water is abstracted from the Ouse to go into water supply. So in the middle, you've got an abstraction at Clapham, which is just upstream of Bedford. Then at Huntingdon, there's an abstraction, and that abstraction provides 99% of the water that's within Graffham Water. So all of the water that goes into Graffham, the vast majority of that is coming from the Great Ouse. And the brown arrow at the top, which seems to be homeless, isn't a mistake. I didn't not delete it. It's potentially an abstraction close to Erith, which would be abstracting from the Great Ouse into the Fens Reservoir. So the Great Ouse system is under pressure from all of this abstraction. Graffham and these towns, along with Cambridge, which is also a growth area, are putting a significant pressure on a common water resource area. The other challenge that you have with this is that all of the wastewater discharges will, from all of that increased growth, are also going to discharge into the Great Ouse. So you have a river system which is at significant pressure. And one of the questions then is, how do we manage those pressures alongside the growth ambitions, which are clearly within this area? So next slide, please. So the pressures on the Great Ouse system, we've got the wastewater or sewage treatment plant discharges. There are combined sewer overflows going in there. Something which often gets forgotten in this, because there's a lot of focus, especially within Cunliffe and in the policy debates which are going on, a lot of focus on the water industry, not so much focus on agricultural diffuse pollution. And if you were to look at headline reasons for not achieving good status within the Great Ouse, then about 40% of the reasons for not achieving good status are down to the wastewater treatment discharges, and about 40% are down to agricultural diffuse pollution. And so both of those need to be dealt with. Urban diffuse pollution and road runoff are seldom talked about, but again, can be major factors in this. There's then the physical modifications, nitrate levels, and we'll see this on the next slide, are affecting the abstractions into Graffham Water. And then they're just capacity constraints of all of this growth on existing infrastructure. Then we've got the downstream impacts on the Ouse washes from eutrophication due to phosphate and also nitrate within the Great Ouse. And then another issue which really doesn't get talked about is whether or not some of the major construction work which is going on, in particular within this area, the Black Cat to Caxton Gibbet dualling of the road there, whether the disturbance of all of that soil is contributing significant amounts of nutrient through wash-off into the river system. And is that one of the main contributors to the rising levels that we're seeing of nitrates within the Great Ouse? Next slide, please. So there is this now increasing interaction, particularly in this area, between water quality and water resources. Graffham, as I say, is a major regional resource, but this winter and also during the spring, it wasn't possible to abstract from the Great Ouse because the levels of nitrate in the ooze were too high to allow abstraction into graphene. And graphene water itself doesn't have any nitrate treatment on the raw water discharge, and therefore you have to manage the levels of nitrate going into graphene water. Nitrate isn't routinely measured by the Environment Agency. It's not a designated parameter under WFD, and we need to think about what the implications of that are. There are these various wastewater potential sources for wastewater, rural diffuse. One of the other things potentially is that we're seeing increasing levels of nitrate in some groundwater. And as you reduce the abstraction from the chalk aquifers, potentially that's giving rise to increased levels of groundwater into the base flows of rivers, and those groundwaters having elevated nitrate levels, which are also potentially contributing to this. We've got various means of tackling this, but sometimes not necessarily used to the full approach. And it's clear that you need a catchment-based approach to address this. And everybody has a role to play in that, from the Environment Agency, Anglian Water, Natural England, the local authorities, developers, all have a role to play in addressing this pressure. Next slide, please. Then one of the other things is that in the short term, especially within this area, actually wastewater treatment capacity is going to be more limiting to growth than water resources. And one of the things that we've done, you can see there a catchment, which is the CAM. So top left-hand corner is this on a GIS system. I find that quite difficult to understand in terms of understanding where the pressures are and where the discharges are. So produce this tube map, as I call it. And then you'll see in the green, amber and red, the sewage treatment works, which supply this area. And then what Anglian Water have done, have now identified, so those coloured red, those sewage treatment works have currently got no capacity to take additional development. On some of the green ones, you'll see on the right-hand side, there's Sawston, which is in red. Below that, it's Great Chesterford. It's got capacity for about another 450 properties. Others have got less capacity. But we need to understand where the developments are going, which sewage treatment works, wastewater treatment plants they're connecting into, and whether or not they've got the capacity to take that wastewater before it then gets discharged. So planning applications need to be considered. The views of the statutory agencies and the water companies need to be considered, so that we've got a single view of what is happening in these areas. Next slide, please. So just finally then, in terms of going forward, we need these asks. So growth must be factored into water and drainage planning processes. So just now, the water resource management planning process and the drainage and wastewater managing processes are only allowed to take into account the growth that's contained within the existing or emerging local plans. But if you take the geography that we've talked about, Milton Keynes growth is not included within that plan. Tempsford sits outside of that plan. Cambridge, the emerging local plan is talking about 60,000 more homes, but government has ambitions for maybe 100,000 more homes than are contained within that emerging plan. How does that growth get taken into account? Just now, the growth isn't allowed to be taken into account, and therefore the water companies don't get the funding to enable them to develop the plans if that growth was to come forward. Also, it's only recently that we've now got something called a growth opener, which enables a water company to go back and say, look, things have happened since we did our initial plans. More growth has come forward. Universal has come forward. We need to be able to reopen our AMP agreement to be able to take account of that growth which has now become apparent so that we can properly plan for it. And then there's a responsibility, I think, for local authorities to make sure, all local authorities, to make sure that both water resources and wastewater treatment needs are included within their local plans, and that they've got an integrated water management plan. And then all of us, whoever's working in this area, the local authorities, the water companies, the regulators, all need to have an agreed set of growth assumptions on which all plans are based with phasing. And it was interesting, in the last round, Ofwat took, in some places, Ofwat took a different approach to the growth assumptions for water resources plans to those that it allowed for drainage plans. Now, that doesn't seem sensible to me. And on water resources plans, they allowed growth. On the drainage plans, in some places, they only allowed historic rates of build out, which are much, much lower. Other water needs outside the local plan process also need to be factored in. So how do we get government growth, universal, East-West Rail, data centres, all included within the water needs assessment? And non-household use, commercial use, can be a great challenge to find out, because it's very difficult to find out 5 years in advance where a commercial entity is thinking of developing new facilities. Water resources often require a regional or a national approach to the answer. So just now, if you take Cambridge as an example, almost 100% of the water supplied within Cambridge comes from within the Cambridge, South Cambridgeshire geography that Cambridge Water has. By about 2040, 50% of the water will come from outside of that geography. Some of the water potentially will be a big swap arrangement whereby water from Minworth, which is Severn Trent water, comes down the Grand Union Canal and then gets abstracted by affinity water. That water then means that the current transfer of water from Graffham down to affinity can then be used instead to go from Graffham into Cambridge. So there needs to be a regional and a national approach to the planning for water resources as well. And then, as I say, in the short to medium term, wastewater treatment capacity is more limiting and needs to be properly factored into these discussions. And then just finally for me, one of the things I think we need to do is get much better at having strategic targeting of environment land management systems, including targeting of headwaters, so that the agriculture measures that are put in place to reduce diffuse pollution actually are placed on a strategic basis to actually deliver measurable benefits in the receiving waters. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paul. Really interesting, and you've touched on quite a few of the issues that we'll hope to cover today. We have a lot to go over, I think, in some of what you've covered. There are certainly elements in there about how to prepare for growth, which is one of the key questions that we have. We have a lot of uncertainties about how we deal with projected growth and how we plan for that, both for water resources and for wastewater. And I'm very glad you've mentioned the wastewater side of things, because that's one that often gets forgotten. And I think there's some interesting questions there around the scale at which we manage these things as well. And that's one of the issues we hope to pick up on through the discussion. Whether the importance of the connections between the national scale and the regional scale and the local scale in terms of how we plan for future growth. And as a resident of Bedford myself, some of those issues are really hitting home for me as well. And how Universal Studios is going to be accommodated in our future growth plans. I look forward to hearing more about that. So to move us on, and I just want to take this opportunity to remind everybody to, if there's questions that they have for the speakers, to put those in the chat, because we won't take questions as we go along. We'll save that for the discussion at the end. But to move along, we will invite our next speaker, who is Daniel Johns. And sticking with the sort of regional scale of assessment at the minute, Daniel is the Managing Director of Water Resources East. And he's going to be talking about strengthening regional governance for water. So over to you, Daniel.
Thanks very much, Heather. Yeah, delighted to be here and to pick up very nicely, I think, from Paul's introductory talk about the importance of kind of regional scale oversight of water resources and the water environment. So we bring up my slides, then we can get underway. So yeah, so first of all, just to introduce Water Resources East for those on the call who may not have come across us before. So first of all, we're pretty unique in governance terms across water resources management in England, at least, and probably much further afield too, in that Water Resources East was set up as an independent, not-for-profit membership organisation. We're a company limited by guarantee. Paul is our chair. But on our board, we have all the kind of sector and different kind of geographic interests in managing water resources as a common resource. This is the driest part of the UK. It's one of the fastest growing, as Paul has very clearly set out. And it's also one of the most depleted from an environmental perspective too. So as part of our governance, we have not only the 4 water companies that operate within the region, we've also got all the existing or emerging strategic authorities across Lincolnshire, Essex, Suffolk, Norfolk, and the Combined Authority of Cambridgeshire and Peterborough. And we've got those other sector interests who also have a real kind of reliance on the water environment through farming, through housing development, through energy generation, and environmental stakeholders too, including the Rivers Trust and just most recently the Norfolk Wildlife Trust. So we are there as one of the 5 regional planning groups, but we are different because we have been set up in that independent way. So we can look across the different sectors, recognising there are kind of sometimes competing interests, sometimes some kind of competing kind of choices and trade-offs to be made. And as an independent organisation, we can have to bring together those different points of view in an evidence-based way and try to work out exactly what the right answer might be to go forward. On the next slide, we talk about our kind of key role under the National Framework for Water Resources, which is the government policy document owned by the Environment Agency, which sets out what Water Resources East and the other 4 regional groups are there to do. And we published the first regional water resources plan for Eastern England back in December 2023. And I'm just going to spend a couple of moments just reminding people what that said. So back 2 years ago, if you go on to the next slide, we said very, very clearly, as I said, in the driest part of the country, we are putting at risk economic prosperity and the health of the water environment through a lack of kind of water management, essentially. In many cases, there is enough water to go around. We're just not very good at managing it and storing it, transferring it to where it's needed. That if we do not take additional action, we will end up by 2050 with an 800 million litres of water per day deficit. That's about a third of existing regional water use. And that means that actually already we have seen constraints emerging for agriculture, for housing, for economic growth, where planning developments, planning applications are put on hold. Abstractors have been able to obviously abstract during the winter months, but certainly during the spring and summer months have had to have license conditions imposed and hands-off flow conditions imposed to restrict their ability to irrigate. And what our plan does in the context of all of that tries to come up with the kind of a set of best value, low regret investments that tackle the identified shortfalls at the point in time where they start to emerge. But as Paul mentions, the plan, baked into the plan is only those adopted local plan projections that were available at the time. And we know very, very much so that since the plan was published 2 years ago, those growth ambitions have moved on markedly, which I'll come back to in a moment. But if we go to the next slide, our plan, as set out 2 years ago, the best value, low regret pathway to 2050 to take into account the changing climates, the need to improve the resilience of drinking water supplies, to be able to return to the environment, the water that nature needs to be in good ecological status. You've got the various infrastructure investments on the right-hand side, some of which Paul mentioned, including the Grafham to Cambridge Water Transfer, which is the tiny little yellow arrow toward the kind of bottom left, you've got strategic reservoir schemes in Lincolnshire and on the Fens, and also one in North Suffolk as well. You've got potentially 3 desalination plants along the east coast in Lincolnshire, Norfolk, and down in Essex. You've got advanced water recycling schemes in Norfolk at Caister, and Suffolk at Lowestoft, and also in Essex at Colchester. So all these different schemes come together on top of, in the short term, demand management, smaller scale schemes, leakage control, and transfers. And the combination of all those different things delivered over the next kind of 20 to 25 years, we found does deliver that combination of different kind of growth, climate change, environmental, and resilience requirements. So going on to the next slide, just want to recognise that, you know, our plan was published 2 years ago. The water sector is an incredibly busy space, lots of policy developments, lots of regulatory advancements and initiatives coming forward. And each year since 2023, we've published an annual progress report to reflect back on the previous 12 months to say, well, has our plan actually been delivered in practice? Are those schemes that we put on a map 2 years ago, are they actually progressing as we hoped they would? If you move on to the next slide, you can see that 2025, last 12 months was incredibly busy. Not least that yet again we had records being broken in terms of being the warmest and sunniest year on record for the UK. Continuing acceleration in growth ambitions that we talked about already. Also the growing importance of those strategic authorities and new national framework for water resources, which I'll talk a bit more about in a moment. We've already mentioned Sir John Cunliffe and the Independent Water Commission that he led, and the Water White Paper that came out from DEFRA just earlier this year, and lots of individual policy announcements around building regulations, water labelling, and all the work that Heather and other people have been doing to try to unlock non-potable water reuse. If you go on to the next slide, what I wanted to pick up at this point is all those regulatory changes that are in the wings being announced by government in response to the Independent Water Commission report, and hopefully will now be taken forward through the Clean Water Bill that Heather mentioned. So Sir John Cunliffe recommended, first of all, a new national water strategy. We haven't had one of those for a very, very long time. A new combined ministerial statement on water industry priorities. So the past price reviews, that the regulatory price reviews that Ofwat has led government to set out its priorities for Ofwat, but what about the Environment Agency, the environmental regulator? And that's one of the things that government wants to solve as part of this cycle, to bring together the economic regulation of water with the environmental regulation of water, to create a single integrated regulator for the water sector, not just water companies, but the water sector more generally, including agriculture, energy, and the environment. So all those different interests together by combining Ofwat with the Drinking Water Inspectorate and relevant parts of the Environment Agency and Natural England. And the creation of regional water authorities. So according to river basin districts, to have an oversight at that regional scale to bring forward holistic system plans that bring together the different interests to address some of those challenges for the water environment that Paul talked about, together with the light touch national coordination function, but confirming that certainly from John's point of view, the 5-year price review cycle should continue. Some people said it should be longer, some people said it would be shorter, but 5 years certainly he thought was about right. And rationalising the number of water company plans, of which there are, toward a dozen, I think about 9 or 10 at least, rationalising all those different company plans down to 2. So 2 frameworks, one around water supply and one around the water environment. On the next slide, though, I wanted just to focus on the kind of that key regional question. So the thesis is essentially that we've got national targets, we've had national strategies coming and going, but there's been very little change in the extent to which the water environment has improved as a result. So a kind of governance gap below that national scale that then leads into local delivery. So John Cunliffe said there should be a national approach, absolutely, but we need to fill that missing middle with regional scale oversight, governance and accountability for improving different aspects of the water environment. Producing cross-sector or spatial plans, bringing together water resources and water environment, potentially aligned with flood planning arrangements as well. Given we've already got regional flood and coastal committees, can we bring that kind of regional scale stuff together for water resources, water policy and flooding at the same time, with a role potentially in directing funding towards specific national and regional objectives, and replacing potentially river basin management plans, the latest cycle of which is now underway to be produced and published next year, with a really strong emphasis on independence and accountability. So this process should not be kind of done by the regulator for the regulator. It needs to be done at arm's length of government and regulation, recognizing different sectors' interests to be able to come up with an objective, evidence-based approach to the right investment in water infrastructure that ministers can then approve. So different aspects, like, for example, a strategic board with an independent chair, an independent secretariat, potentially of 20 to 50 people, Sir John thought was necessary, and some choices around how that is constituted. Certainly, Sir John favoured quite a statutory approach of, a new public authority, a new public body of some sort, but other options are available. On the next slide, just wanted to kind of talk about what we already have in place through the new National Framework for Water Resources that was published last year. And just to reflect that within the national framework, this is the second iteration that came out. The previous one in 2020 started down this path, but that was really accelerated in 2025 in thinking about multi-sector planning. First of all, this is not just about water companies, it's about multi-sector planning, given the different interests competing in some cases for the water environments. In the kind of red and the pink, thinking about how to not only deliver kind of water resources resilience, but also about protecting and improving the water environment. And in the blue on the right-hand side, a whole series of different requirements for regional groups around supporting an integrated approach to water management. So thinking about bringing together water resources plans with drainage and wastewater management plans, integrating catchment and nature-based solutions. So if you look at the National Framework Water Resources, reflect on these different requirements already being set for the regional groups to encompass within their second round of regional plans. We're already getting toward what Cunliffe was talking about. I would say if Cunliffe is water resources or water planning 2.0, the national framework is at least kind of 1.5, let's say. We're taking a big step towards what Cunliffe pulled together if we deliver the regional plans in accordance with the national framework as was published last year. And just to kind of reinforce that point in terms of water resources' own role on the next slide, that in putting forward, if you can just bring up the next slide, in developing our next regional plan, which is due to be published in 2029, if you just click through this slide, different elements will appear. So first of all, we've already got that cross-sector governance under Paul's chairmanship. We're already developing detailed regional scale data sets and planning tools and making those available to the people that, through catchment partnerships, through our partners and members at that regional scale, working very closely with national government. On the right-hand side, as Paul has already mentioned, we've got tube maps that tell us for particular catchments how they actually work and operate in practice, looking at where the abstractions are, looking at where the pressures are, looking at where the options could be to address some of those pressures. We've developed and tested some of these different models and approaches with catchment partnerships already in a series of kind of catchment by catchment workshops we organised over last winter. And that's highlighting particular investments and options that we need to consider in the round as part of our integrated plans. So the methodology on the right-hand side, the bottom right, talks about how we might bring together all those different options for a particular place and come up with our next cut of the best value regional plan. So on the next slide, this is the pitch to DEFRA, that if you're thinking in response to Sir John Cunliffe, in response to the Independent Water Commission's report and the Water White Paper, do you really need to set up new regional water authorities that have statutory footing, large secretariats, lots of expensive models and mapping that needs to be done, that needs to support them, when you've already got groups like Water Resources East that is doing, if not 80, perhaps 90% of what Cunliffe set out should be done, with the potential to go even further. That we are regional scale, we map and plan to hydrological boundaries. We are an independent organisation with an independent chair. We've got that multi-sector and strategic authority represented on our board already. We're tied in with local growth plans and local nature recovery strategies. Our focus to date has certainly been on water supply planning, but increasingly we're getting into that interaction between water supply and water quality as Paul set out. We have the relationships already with farm clusters, with catchment partnerships. We're able to direct funding from different sources, public, private, philanthropic, to catchment pilots and delivery plans. We can coordinate consultation and engagement in the way that John mapped out, and yet we're not a statutory body. We're not a statutory planning function, and I would argue that's a good thing, because it means we can move more quickly, we can be more agile, and we can be more cost effective. and not least because the costs of running WRE so far have fallen on the water companies and our member organisations as opposed to the government. And rather than 30, 20 to 50 people, we've got a team size of 12. So there's my pitch to DEFRA. If you want to move on to the very last slide, we want to set forth over the next 12 to 18 months or so a series of regional scale pilots that demonstrate the value of regional system planning, taking national targets, taking whatever kind of requirements of regional system planning that government wants to set, agreeing funding and resources to be able to get that process going, but applying our multi-sector governance, applying our regional scale data sets and tools to this problem, and coming up with a first cut regional water system plan by, let's say, 18 months to 2 years' time, building on all the great work being delivered by catchment partnerships, trying to figure out exactly what an integrated catchment investment plan might look like, funded from, say, public, private, philanthropic, different kind of strategic and statutory body in funding, building on river basin management plans and local nature recovery strategies to identify exactly what investments we need to tackle the pressures on the wider water environment. So that's the approach that we've been setting out to DEFRA. We're yet to hear exactly how they would like to take things forward, including through the Clean Water Bill, but hopefully we're well placed to pitch and to pilot exactly this kind of approach in the east of England over the coming months. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Daniel. And thanks for highlighting some of the great work that the regional Water Resources East and some of the regional authorities are already doing, doing some of that regional planning and connections across the water sector. So beyond just the water companies, but also to the other elements of the sector, agricultural and other users. I think there's some very interesting questions to follow up there on the emerging role of the regional planning authorities and what role they're going to have under whatever new legislative framework that we end up with, and some interesting questions about the how we plan for growth, and something that Paul had picked up on as well. And will the regional authorities and the planning work that they do, will it make it easier for us to anticipate and respond to some of these new growth areas? We're already seeing questions in the chat around things like data centers and some of those types of new demands that we're seeing, and to what extent are we able to respond to those new demands in our planning framework. So I think there's some interesting things to follow up there in the discussion section. So moving on again, our next speaker is confusingly also named Dan, but is Dan Walker-Nolan, who is from Water UK. And he's going to talk to us about, again, following on nicely, what some of this new water regulation should look like, and what's the perspective from the water industry on that. Thanks, Dan.
Yeah, thanks very much for the introduction, Heather, and for the invite today. I'm not going to give as strong a pitch, certainly not for a statutory role for Water UK going forward. However, I will be talking a little bit about the challenge that we see at the moment, how current regulation works, and then how we want future regulation to work. And for those of you who don't know, Water UK is the trade association for water and sewage undertakers in the UK. So that includes the privatised companies in England, but also the mutual in Wales and the public companies in Scotland and Northern Ireland. So we bring an overall perspective to this issue. So firstly, I want to talk a little bit about the challenge. So if I can have a slide, please. And the next slide, please. Thank you. So I'm going to go clockwise from the top left-hand corner, and I go around the page. And anyone who has been following the sector or picked up a newspaper, indeed, in the last 5 years will know that the water sector is under enormous stress and pressure at the moment. And indeed, our wider water environment, it also has some big questions hovering over it, certainly in terms of the public consciousness and how we are viewed. So firstly, top left-hand corner, without action, the gap between supply and demand for public water supply in 2055 will be 5 billion litres of water a day. So that is pretty huge. And if we don't get on top of the issue, then there will not be sufficient water available for businesses and homes to be built and for the economy to grow. And then the next little picture there and headline, drought is becoming a seemingly common feature of our water system. And we had shortages leading to hosepipe bans seemingly more often over the last few years, so 2018, 2022 and 2025. and then you'll see the next issue, which is the environment and rivers and river health. And although a lot of progress has been made on reducing ammonia and phosphorus discharges from wastewater treatment, people will probably be aware that less than 1 in 5 of England's rivers meet good ecological status, and none meet good chemical status currently. And then if we go on to sewage, which is obviously a very, very big and contested topic. So, obviously sewage spills have been lodged in the public imagination, and they're continuing to make headlines while improvements are being made. So there is a £12 billion programme that was signed off between 2025 and 2030 to reduce sewage by about 50%. And onward investment over the next 25 years. Improvements will take a little bit of time to come through, so it will probably continue to be a matter of public debate and interest. And then finally, in the bottom left-hand corner, as if we didn't have enough issues, threats and pollutants in drinking water and public water supply continue to be an issue that the water companies and the sector have to pay a lot of attention to. So we need to be conscious of threats, for example, from PFAS. Now, I should say in this statement that every single sample of drinking water taken at the tap was within safe limits for PFAS in the last reporting year, and the industry is very, very proud of that. We're very, very proud that Yale University has independently assessed the British water as being the best drinking water in the world. However, there are threats. So in raw water sources, PFAS, as we know, is very, very difficult to remove. It's bioaccumulative. So we will need to continue, particularly in raw water sources, to think about how best PFAS can be removed to keep that status as fantastic drinking water in the UK. Can I have the next slide, please? So current regulation, this is a bit of a facetious question, but help or hindrance? And you'll see there is a very, very small diagram next to the first bullet point. So my first point is that the rules are too complex, and you will see that from the diagram, which is the heroic attempt of the Cunliffe Commission to map all of the different rules, regulations, responsibilities and bodies that are involved in water. And there are over 100 pieces of legislation that they found that impinged on the water sector in some way. What's more, and I think this might have been mentioned by Paul, water companies produce 9 statutory plans for different things in their ambit, all on different cadences, and they will decide what goes into ultimately their business plan, which is what they get funding for on a 5-yearly basis for offer in terms of customer service, environmental improvement. And in the last price control, the business plans went to 55,000 pages. So, really, really complex stuff that we're dealing with here as a sector. And then the second point, to sort of lump on top of complexity, regulators' objectives don't always align, although the responsibilities overlap. So in terms of objectives not always aligning, you have the Environment Agency, who are sort of very, very clear on needing to meet environmental regulation, sometimes whatever the cost or unintended consequences of that. I'm happy to talk about that a bit later, while Ofwat have historically prioritised cheaper bills over quality or resilience. And what's more, if we talk about enforcement, for example, of environmental quality parameters, you often get into a situation where there's sort of like triple or even quadruple jeopardy, whereby because both regulators have an interest in environmental objectives, one incident from a company can be punished in 3 or 4 different ways, which creates this kind of vicious circle whereby the improvements can't be made because there are both regulators that are bearing down on issues that are rightly being tackled. And finally, on the current regulation, there are changes in regulation, again, because of the disjoint between regulators that are introduced mid-funding cycle that sometimes can be quite problematic for companies to implement and to put into their programs. So, 2 years through a price control, the environmental quality regulator can decide that it wants companies to do something new, which costs more money, and then that creates problems for planning in and also for financing. And again, that is something of a difficulty for the sector because it means that they are constantly trying to sort of keep up with themselves and with the developing environment. If you go to the next slide, please. So I have tried to map out here on this slide a little bit how regulation should work, and then there's my personal view on whether it will happen and the confidence level I have in whether it will happen. And you know, as has been noted by Paul and Daniel so far, you know, all sectors responsible for pollution should play a role in remediating impacts. So, you know, there have been comments so far that I'll associate myself with about agriculture, about highways. You know, there is this really, really good idea from the Cunliffe Commission that has been picked up by the government that there will be a system of regional system planning so that all the pressures on the water system can be dealt with and everyone can play a role in making it better. I think this needs to include DEFRA having a look at the levers that it has. So again, Paul mentioned ELMs, so the subsidies that are given to farmers and how those can be sort of geo-mapped so that they can meet water quality aims more effectively, and also flooding budgets and flooding infrastructure and how that can, again, help broader water quality objectives. So that's a really, really important thing that has been suggested. Government is committed to regional planners. So I've given that a tick because I think there's reasons to be optimistic on that. The next thing, which is really, really important alongside those regional planners, is that regulators should be afforded discretion to manage outcomes rather than outputs. Now, what do I mean by that? So both the Corrie Review and the Independent Water Commission have backed the use of something called constrained discretion. So that's the idea of flexing regulatory requirements to allow different actors to focus on outcomes they're trying to achieve rather than necessarily the means of achieving it. So, for example, that could mean paying farmers to do more work in a catchment to reduce nutrient pollution rather than increasing chemical treatment at wastewater treatment works. And at the moment, that is more difficult than it should be because the EA regulates via permits and parameters in those permits. So having that flexibility is quite difficult, but constrained discretion is really, really important. It has featured recently in the strategic policy statement to the Environment Agency. And so we are very, very optimistic that it will happen and it will make a difference. So I have given that also a tick. And then finally, next slide, please. What else needs to happen in order to make sure that we have better regulation that facilitates sort of better outcomes for customers in the environment? So yeah, the next point is regulation being coherent and day-to-day decisions being made at arm's length from government, and I've given that a sort of like tick and a question mark. The single regulator that was suggested by Cunliffe and accepted by DEFRA should be a great step forward for solving some of the disjoints related to enforcement and objectives in policy. And you know, the single regulator will need to take more factors into account when it's making decisions, which I think is really good because you don't get those problems whereby the regulator that is looking at sort of the economy and the environment are potentially at loggerheads. However, there is an interesting question about the level of independence the new regulator has from government, and we think that anything that's too close to government and takes too much day-to-day direction from ministers rather than taking a strategic steer has implications for the investability of the sector, which just needs to be thought about very, very carefully. And then finally, decisions on difficult trade-offs should be made at the right level. So given cost of living pressures in particular, the government is really rightly concerned about the challenge of further bill shocks, and indeed in the white paper on water has kind of committed to not having bill shocks anymore. However, if you look at a simple rolling forward of environmental commitments in particular that we have at the moment from this price control to the next price control, that could cause another big growth in bills. So there does need to be some trade-off made at a strategic level about what the system should deliver and how it should deliver it. And we think the government needs to make sure that it is taking those trade-offs and not outsourcing decisions on that to regulators. And you know, in the past it has been up to organizations like Ofwat to make those trade-offs on behalf of government, and you know, it has unfortunately chosen bills rather than resilience and quality. So we would urge the government to make sure that it is making those trade-offs up front so that it's not regulators that are doing that. That is the end of my contribution. Thanks very much.
Great, thanks, Dan. Again, quite a lot of interesting perspectives to follow up on there. Great to hear the perspective of the trade body for water companies. I think thanks for touching on the slightly touchy issue of what all this is going to mean for the impact on bills and affordability and investability in the sector. I think there's going to be some interesting follow-ups on that. Thanks to all the audience members who have been busily putting questions into the chat. We've seen some really interesting ones come through already. Please keep that up. I do recall having taken a peek at the participant list beforehand that there were some signed up participants from the regulators, so perhaps we'll see some responses from them to some of Dan's comments in the chat. Let's see. But to move on to our final speaker, last but certainly not least, someone who could give us the perspective of the agricultural sector on all of this. I welcome Mark Betson, who's from the National Farmers Union, and is going to be giving us his presentation around impacts for the agricultural sector. So over to you, Mark.
Thank you very much for that. If we could have the first slide. Lovely, thank you. Just by way of introduction, the NFU, National Farmers Union, covers farmers and growers across the England and Wales, has about 44,000 members, and it's one of the largest industry bodies covering agriculture. I cover water resources for them, so I won't be covering diffuse water pollution specifically, though I would say that we are very much up for the conversation about how we can better retain and utilise nutrients within the environment, because that's in everyone's interest at the end of the day. Very happy to sort of take questions away if there is any on those specific areas. On the areas I cover, which is access to water for agriculture, I was going to take you through what are the immediate challenges with regards to access to water, some of the intermediate challenges that we have with regards to regulation, and then look at something along the lines of a long-term vision of where we would like to see regulation go in order to support our members, farming businesses, and food security in the country in general. So to start with, the immediate most apparent challenge that farmers are facing is that generated by extreme weather events through climate change. And that was something that was picked up recently in the Climate Change Committee's well-adapted report. This year has been a very interesting season to begin with. It sort of parallels in part what happened last year in terms of the very dry spring we've had. And certainly in eastern parts of the country, we've seen a really sort of dry start that's seen soil moisture deficit, SMD, rise to very high levels at an early stage, which has led to an irrigation beginning very quickly. The result, the sort of upshot of that is that those people who are preparing for the sort of resilience that is necessary to meet some of these challenges with climate change and lack of water at sort of during the drier months of the year are having to utilize the water they have more rapidly in order to meet the demands necessary to produce the crops which they are supplying to supermarkets. One of the sort of immediate challenges we have is making sure that there is good communication between those growers and regulators, and with the available data that's necessary in order to make decisions on the ground in terms of access to water. So one of the lessons we learned from last year is about how to do that more effectively. So that's an immediate sort of challenge that we are wrestling with and overcoming in terms of just what can we do on a day-to-day basis. It is highlighting to agricultural growers about the priority of the measures necessary to adapt to the changes in climate that we're seeing. And that is a driving factor in building resilience to their businesses. And we need to ensure that regulation going forward will meet some of those, will be an enabling factor in terms of adaptation in order to meet the challenges that extreme weather brings, and then enabling growers to produce the food which is being sought after more by national strategy and by consumers on the ground. Next slide, please. I mentioned the well-adapted report by the Climate Change Committee. That drew on some evidence that we put together from farmers that we surveyed over the last 10 years about their experiences with extreme weather. And sort of 70% and higher saw that extreme weather events impacted their businesses substantially during that period. And if I have the next slide, please. in terms of how much that actually impacted their businesses, we can see here that on average, about £40,000 from the was lost to businesses as a result of extreme weather events, and that just demonstrated some of the challenge that's around the impacts of dry weather, that agricultural businesses are feeling that they need to generate the adaptation necessary in order to meet those challenges. If I could have the next slide, please. So that's one of the most important drivers, I would argue, at the moment in terms of how we go forward with particularly water resources, with agriculture, in tackling what people are experiencing on the ground now with access to water, in order to sustain growing particularly those crops which rely on irrigation, that irrigation being critical for producing fresh fruit, vegetables, and those crops which are being sought after, particularly in the National Food Strategy, in terms of healthy diets. In terms of the more intermediate regulatory challenges, we've already had Daniel mentioning about the national framework. That is generating a lot of forward look in terms of how we can better adapt to ensure that there is sufficient water left within the environment and to meet future growth challenges. So in terms of playing our part in that contribution, agriculture is looking at how can we adapt to enable that going forward. That, though, has to sort of be met in terms of where we're going with the regulatory environment in order to try and achieve some of that sustainability with access to water as we sort of go forward into the requirements we have in the future. So if I go to the next slide. So click on, please, 3 times, 2, 3. Thank you very much. In terms of some of the regulatory challenges that we're having, it's around programs to look at making abstraction more sustainable across the country. And we've already got programs in place that are looking at reducing the amount of underused or unused licenses, and where there are particular challenges around the environment that are coming from the Habitats Directive and the flow levels necessary as part of the Water Framework Directive. That's a beginning of a process which is going to move on to look at how can we achieve some of this through new powers that the Environment Agency will gain in 2028 in terms of being able to vary or revoke abstraction licenses. And I just need to sort of point out that although agriculture is not a big user of water in terms of volume, in terms of the number of licenses, it has the largest number of abstraction licenses of a particular sector. So in terms of an individual license holder, some of the changes coming forward will be of significant impact to them. And so in 2028, the Environment Agency can vary or revoke licenses. So that gives them new powers in order to achieve some of the targets they have in terms of flow levels in rivers, for example, and with groundwater. That, though, is a start of a process which then leads on to where we want to get to, that takes into account the issues relating to climate change, some of the issues around growth and development you've heard from Paul and from Daniel and from Dan, and then also where new business water demands are going to be coming from. We've had mention of data centres, but there's also additional use for energy, etc. So we can see that there is a series of programs going forward from a policy perspective that is aiming through regulation to deliver sustainable water. And that needs to be communicated effectively to those who are going to be impacted by those changes, and sufficient changes made in order for, if particularly want a business to survive in these circumstances, particularly one that depends on water, to make the changes necessary so that they can still deliver what they do without impacting the environment in such a way. So if I go to the next slide, please. In order to do that, alongside the default regulatory pathway, which will lead to sort of reductions in available water through licensing, there needs to be additional pathways as options in terms of where we see businesses coming together in order to generate their own solutions to these problems. These solutions can be tailored to meet individual business demands, organised locally, and then they can be put forward as options which still meet the regulatory challenges in terms of available water, but do so in a way which businesses can own and impact them in a way which they feel they can handle and they can develop in their own way. That can be done through groups of abstractors coming together to work collaboratively on solutions, or potentially at a more regional level that they can work with regional planning, for example, to come up with different options, working across sectors to utilise water in a more effective manner. One of the key points is, though, that I mentioned those different programs that are going forward, looking at making abstraction sustainable. We need to see a clear, joined-up narrative by regulators about all of these programs. One of the challenges is that if these are done in a disjointed manner, particularly to small abstractors, these will not seem like a coherent program. They will also not necessarily be seen in the whole. They will be seen individually. So business decisions may be made on the basis of one program coming forward with one set of changes to licenses. That may not be sustainable in the long term if they suddenly have another set of changes which are brought upon them that they weren't expecting. So a clear joined up narrative is going to be absolutely critical in order to deliver some of these changes in a way which is both sustainable and investable for businesses. Next slide, please. One of the key aspects that's been identified for agriculture in terms of planning is the ability to store water, and so on-farm reservoirs are absolutely critical. We've seen some positive moves with the proposed National Planning Policy Framework in terms of a positive view of proposals to develop reservoirs, and there are positive proposals also in the Farming Profitability Review with permitted development and with potential tax relief in terms of capital allowances with investing in such infrastructure as reservoirs. I've mentioned about the opportunity of farmers coming together to come up with their own options. The EA are funding local resource options for that very thing, bringing farmers together to discuss what options they can bring forward, and then those being reviewed by a consultant in terms of which one's going to be the most valuable. However, what's really critical at this point in time is then what are the next steps to actually delivering that on the ground? What are the incentives, and how can we de-risk the process so that more farm reservoirs are built, greater on-farm storage, and that some of the challenges that the food sector are going to encounter in terms of access to water are met within time in terms of improving food security, basically. Next slide, please. I won't go over too much about the new Water White Paper and the formation of the new regulator and the new regional groups that are coming forward, because that's already been covered by others. What I would say is that there is a story to tell within each of these river basin districts from the regional planning perspective that explains why different sectors have a need for water and what that need is within that area. And I'm going to give you an example from the southeast in terms of agriculture and why water is critical and how agriculture features into more than just the water strategy, but wider national narratives. So if I go to the next slide, please. So looking at the southeast produces some really high value crops worth about 5.125 billion across the food chain, and it's produces high proportions of particular foods that are seen as important in terms of healthy diets. 60% of UK apples, fruit in particular within Kent, but also other areas such as vineyards, which are increasingly important in terms of the agricultural sector. So it's a high value industry. And if I go to the next slide, please. It's a high value industry with some really important production clusters that are real exemplars of technology in terms of how water is used. It produces a high proportion of what we are looking for in terms of, I mentioned about the National Food Strategy, about the critical foods for healthy diets. It utilizes new technology in terms of how water is used, how crops are irrigated, and it is has got some really important growth clusters for those particular areas. However, all of that work is underpinned by access to water. So it is absolutely critical to be involved and to engage with the process in terms of being enabling the sector to go forward and to produce more of what's required of it. Final slide, please. So in terms of an overview of what I've gone over there, so that was the sort of narrative for one particular region. Each region can tell its own narrative and has particular areas that they have strengths in, that are particular concerns in terms of water, and also particular mechanisms by which agriculture can be part of the process of addressing that. As I mentioned, adapting to climate change is one of the most critical elements for us at the moment, and that's almost abstracted from where we are with regulation. That's going to be a challenge we have to face, whatever regulation we have got coming down the road. Regulation, though, needs to be aware of this and needs to take into account of that in terms of how it allows us to do that. So things like dynamic licensing, so not focusing so much on dates for abstraction, but much more on when water is available, can we abstract? That's a critical element of adapting to climate change with regulation. I've mentioned about storage, increasing farm storage, a key component to meeting demand at peak periods. Agriculture is very good at delivering quickly on some of these aspects, whereas quite understandably, public water supply in terms of delivering large strategic resource options in terms of big reservoirs can take many years to develop. Agriculture can develop reservoirs in a relatively short period of time, but does need some notice to be able to do it. It also needs more of an. It also benefits from an incentive in terms of doing that, in terms of whether there is a tax benefit or whether there is things like the water management grant that just enables people to take that investment forward with a degree of confidence. I think that the move that's demonstrated in Cunliffe in terms of regional planning is absolutely critical, and planning at the catchment level should be the cornerstone in terms of how we look at what are the most sustainable options that actually meet the needs of local communities and local businesses. There should be a degree of coherence that is defined by a national strategy, but there should also be a join up between different sectors and departments in terms of thinking how we deal with food, we deal with energy, we deal with water, and how we deal with the environment. All of these should be brought together at a regional and at a local level within catchments in order to deliver that as a sort of ideal future vision of where I'd like to see water go. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Mark. Some really interesting perspectives there on the farming sector and the role of farmers and the incentives that they have to be able to play their part in improving water resilience. So thanks a lot for that. And I wanted to thank all 4 of our speakers for giving us some really, really interesting perspectives and plenty of food for thought for following up on in the discussion. On that note, I would like to encourage you all to keep posting questions in the chat. There's been quite a few interesting ones emerge already, but please do keep that up. At the moment, we're going to take a short break for a comfort break, give everybody the chance to rest and think. But while that break is happening, please do continue to put questions in the chat and also have a look at WIRe on LinkedIn. I think a code will be posted where you can look up. Yes, it's been posted online now. You can have a look at the activities of WIRe on LinkedIn. So please do follow that. So thanks very much, and we'll see you back shortly.
So we're now going to start the discussion. So we'll welcome back in a moment all 4 of the speakers who kindly gave their talks earlier on. But we're also going to introduce 2 of our WIRe PhD students who are also going to form part of the panel. So first up, I would like to introduce Joanna and Sebastian. So perhaps they could introduce themselves. So perhaps, Joanna, could I ask you to say hello and introduce who you are and just perhaps a tiny little bit about what you're working on?
Sure. Hello. I am part of the Sheffield University Management School, and more specifically the Institute of Work Psychology. And as part of my PhD, I'm researching the boundary crossing knowledge transfer mechanisms as the enablers of innovation implementation in the water industry. But to lose some of the scientific jargon and explain it plainly, basically what I'm looking at is how does knowledge about innovation developed by one group of people in an organization needs to flow so that another group of people who are supposed to embed this innovation in daily operations can do it successfully. And prior to focusing on organizational psychology and innovation, I had an international career in marketing and business development for global legal, audit and consulting firms, and followed by a stint as a marketing director of an environmental technology startup.
Super, thank you, Joanna. Yeah, so some really interesting aspects where regulation certainly will have an influence on things. So great stuff. So thank you. Sebastian.
Afternoon, everybody. Yeah, I'm Sebastian Gibbs as well. I'm actually part of the Cranfield aspect of the WIRe CDT. So both Joanna and myself joined the CDT this year in the latest round of cohorts. So my particular focus in my PhD is around the treatment of PFAS, has been previously mentioned, also known as forever chemicals, often in the media, and how can we improve the removal of those through granular activated carbon. Prior to joining the CDT, I was working at Anglian Water as a optimization engineer, generally focusing on energy optimizations within the water resource and supply aspect of the business, and kind of started my career previously in that in water, soil and groundwater remediation, where the business that I worked for did quite a lot of work in the background on PFAS, which kind of brought me into this journey of PFAS treatment.
Brilliant. Thank you, Sebastian. And we've already had some questions linked through to PFAS, so I'm sure they will come up as we go through. So yes, we've already had a number of really great questions, which the panelists will have seen, I'm sure. But if you have anything else that you would like to talk around, please do drop those into the comments box, and we'll try and get through them. We've got about 40-45 minutes in terms of the time for the questions, so we'll see where we get to. We perhaps won't get through all of them, but we'll do our best to ask the panelists as many as we can. Okay, so I'm going to kind of kick off the discussion. So we've had a couple of questions through around, I guess, consideration of more holistic regulation, particularly in relation to water and other sectors. So I'm going to start off with a question from Graham around, are we at risk of planning water resilience in isolation from maybe energy and digital infrastructure, particularly in relation to emerging industry needs that we might not necessarily have initially planned for? For example, AI, data centers, new theme parks arising, but those sorts of things. So how do we get that better integration? So in terms of when we're asking these questions, if you kind of think that you've got a good response and want to take the lead, just wave your hand and we'll come to you, and then we'll go round everyone who wants to discuss that particular topic. So does anybody want to kick us off on that one? Daniel Johns.
Yeah, I can give it a go. So, I mean, that's essentially in part why Water Resources East was set up, not just for the water companies, but for the wider water environment and all these different competing interests. So absolutely trying to figure out where the data centers might go, how much water they might need. Absolutely talking to the agricultural sector, including Mark and our agricultural representative on our board about the sector's need, including through food and drink manufacturing. But some of it is uncertain. You know, as Paul was saying, it's very difficult to know exactly what development will happen where, what's the nature of that development. You know, if you've got a local plan which talks about, like a new business park with warehousing, there's a massive difference in water use between an Amazon warehouse for distribution and an Amazon Web Services data center. And we won't necessarily know which of those different possible uses it might be until whoever it is that buys the warehouse, sets up shop. So I think part of the answer here is to recognise that uncertainty and to plan for it, to know and to bring forward investments on the basis of incomplete information, that we want to take decisions in the short term which are low regret. And you know what? If we overbuild capacity in the short term on the basis of that uncertainty, and maybe we don't need absolutely every single investment, is that the worst thing? Because the costs of underinvestment are much bigger for the economy and for the environment than the costs of overinvestment.
Thank you, Dan. Any other colleagues? Yes.
Yep.
Second Dan first, and we'll go to Paul.
Yeah, I just associate those comments with myself as well, from Daniel. Very sensible. So having a system where we plan for headroom rather than to sort of meet demand based on targets that might be in local plans. I mean, we know when the Labour government, for example, was elected, it changed the target for housing growth, and the water sector is now having to keep up because it had a more pessimistic assumption on that in its WRMPs. So planning for some sort of headroom optimistically to make sure that we can deliver if there are bumps in the road, and if there's additional economic growth, which would be very welcome, is a really, really sensible thing to do. And just as regards data centers, people have talked about the National Framework for Water Resources. They don't actually feature in that. So, you know, the plan isn't inclusive of that. So again, all the more reason to build in headroom to make sure that we have a little bit of capacity if those new economic growth demands come along.
Thank you. Paul.
Yeah, just a couple of points for me. One is just on the data center one, you don't actually need single pass water from the public water supply to cool a data center. So there are different models which have got different uses, different costs associated with it. You could go to an air-cooled system. So I think we just need to one of the reasons why people go to single pass water is cheap. I think water is too cheap, and that is part of the issue that we have in some of this. But I think that question, which is how do you provide sufficient water for future unknown needs, is a particularly challenging one. And it does come down to this, should you have headroom and how much headroom? And I think that sort of goes to the growth question as well, because that then becomes a policy choice, which is it could be that your water resources plan should be a plan with 20% of headroom for the next 5 to 10 years. That's a perfect, sensible way of doing it. There will be a cost associated with that. One of the things that people often point to is Kielder Reservoir up in Northumbria, which was provided for a potential industry need on the northeast coast. And then that industry didn't ever materialize. And so you were then left with this very large water supply, which now is coming into its own, but has been virtually unused for a number of years. Now, there's just an economic cost associated with that. And that, for me, is a policy choice that that government and policymakers should be grappling with around how much headroom to plan in for future growth.
Great, thank you, Paul. Are there any other additional comments on that one? Yeah, everyone wants to say something. So yeah, we'll go round on this first one. So let's go with Joanna first.
Yeah, well, I suppose this question touches on a bigger issue generally of how to future-proof regulation broadly, not just planning for potentially unknown, but how to regulate for development in the future that we may not yet be able to foresee. And I think that's the question that many sectors are grappling with. The whole sort of pace of technological development is such that pretty much every industry is finding itself with regulation that's suddenly out of date. And so I think there are a couple of sort of principles that are important here to bear in mind. One of the things mentioned already, I can't remember who mentioned it, might have been a few people, Dan definitely, outcome-based regulation rather than really prescriptive rules. And I think just, you know, when I think about innovation in particular, which is the area I'm looking at, if you prescribe really specifically how certain things need to be delivered, Regulation 31 being an example, you then find yourself with bottlenecks. So yeah, looking much more at outcomes rather than prescriptive, what to use, how to do it, how to test for it. And then, you know, future-proofing in terms of quick ability to test, innovate, the sandboxes, which have been mentioned both by Cunliffe, but also then in the white paper, I think crucial in order to be able to speed up innovation and understanding that sometimes you need a longer period. You know, it's not just the quick trial, but in order to observe certain efficiencies, those sandboxes have to have a longer shelf life. one of the things that I suppose is not necessarily often mentioned is the kind of international regulatory coordination. And I know that, in this country, that may have been a period of taking back control of everything and regulating for everything here rather than sharing it internationally. But there is something to be said for looking at other jurisdictions which may be more advanced in certain sort of uses of water, whether it's the kind of Singapore or other places where they are, reusing water for consumption. Perhaps the new regulation in the UK could be utilizing some of the best practice internationally and building some mechanisms that enable the regulation to be much more nimble and agile.
Super, thank you. Okay, we'll go then to Mark and then Sebastian.
Thanks for that. Yes, one of the challenges that I mentioned at the end of my presentation was around join up between different departments in terms of critical goals, and I think that's really important when it comes to being able to align some of these challenges with available water, for example. I would like, for example, I mentioned about the food strategy, making sure that that's aligned with other areas such as land use framework, and in terms of also where we want to sort of develop data centers, where we want to build new energy plants. One of the challenges, though, with that is that if it's not done at a sort of departmental level, then a lot of the burden then falls on, if you follow Cunliffe through, on a regional level. And it's making sure that there is sufficient capacity and resource available at that regional level to try and make some of those trade-offs, because inevitably there'll have to be trade-offs. And it's having the necessary structures, resource to do the modelling, to bring sectors together, to have the necessary conversations, that is absolutely critical. And at the moment, the water resource groups are doing a very good job of trying to do that. But is there a better way? Or is there going to be a sort of follow-up with that with the new regional systems planner? How's that going to be resourced? How's that going to be fitted in within the regulation? All of these are questions that we hope the Clean Water Bill might sort of begin to answer. But again, it's one of the challenges about, can we do what is a challenge at the departmental level, at the local level, and come up with solutions which work practically for people on the ground?
Thank you. And then, finally from Sebastian.
I think my kind of thought on it was also around kind of what we're putting into the developers' hands, or the people that are introducing these developments, these new kind of infrastructures. What intrinsic designs do they have to try and support that water resource challenges? So again, it's mentioned in the Cunliffe report around the kind of introducing more legislation around water reuse, water recycling, water harvesting, but how do we then kind of bring that into understanding what that means for those things like headrooms and so on? Obviously, that's not something that we can concrete say how much is possible to recover from, be it rainwater and so on, in that kind of industrial development or theme parks and so on, but at least it would then kind of bring in some of that potential for those sources, those sites themselves, to be sourcing their own water just through the particular land use. And is that something that we could kind of strengthen in terms of trying to kind of stop those kind of shocks happening at the moment of use?
Thank you. Some really, really interesting comments coming through there. We have had someone state that certainly the water companies in their planning, they do have some headroom already planned in, but I guess the point is whether that's enough in relation to some of these bigger challenges. But that's quite a comprehensive set of answers to that question. So Heather, I'll pass over to you for the next one.
Thanks. And I think probably one of the challenges I have in this particular role is stopping myself from asking all of the questions and actually letting some of the audience questions come through, because obviously I could just spend ages talking to these speakers about these topics. But I want to pick up on something that has come up a couple of times and in a couple of the comments, and Paul started mentioning it in his talk on the and sticking with this theme of more integrated regulation. The links between water resources planning on the one hand and wastewater planning on the other hand. Paul's already mentioned that wastewater planning can sometimes be the more limiting factor in growth, but it's also potentially some of the more one of the more hidden factors. We know that there is some potential misalignment. There was a question from Kavya about potential misalignment between the water resource planning frameworks on the one hand and the drainage and wastewater planning frameworks on the other, and what implications do those misalignments have. So I just wondered if you would reflect on, are we improving in this alignment between water resource planning on the one hand and wastewater planning on the other? And will the changes we are seeing in regulation help improve that, particularly as we advance things like water recycling, which has been mentioned? So who wants to start us with that? Well, Paul, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, just to start, because I think it's not just the water planning that needs to be taken into account here, but it's also the local planning. And how do we bring local authority planning and spatial town and country planning together with the water planning? And at the local authority level, what's the responsibility of the local authorities in this space for identifying where the developments are going to be? So locations, having the discussion with the water companies in terms of, and then where is the capacity, or in the wastewater treatment plants, and in particular then what phasing is going to happen to enable the expansion of wastewater treatment plants through the AMP process. And the AMP process, like the asset management planning process, goes on a 5-year cycle. And if the housing with housing numbers over a phased period is known, then the water companies are able to address that and deal with it. Just now, it's where planning applications come out with that cycle, and there isn't an alignment with the local planning cycle and the water resource management planning cycle, or the drainage cycle, which are going on the AMP processes. So I think much better alignment between local plans and the responsibility of local authorities. And I think there should be joint and strategic plans for water associated with developments. And if you had that, then I think this is all doable. But and one of the problems in that, and one of the solutions. So one of the issues with that is that town and country planning sits with MHCLG, and local authorities sit with MHCLG. Water sits with DEFRA, and water resource management planning and drainage planning sit with DEFRA. Trying to get the join up between government departments so that they come out with a single view can be challenging. One of the successes of the Cambridge Water Scarcity Group that Daniel sits on, that I chair, is that that's an MHCLG sponsored group which is jointly run between MHCLG and DEFRA, and therefore you've got the right people in the room at the right time who are able to make decisions and take those forward. And I think that's vital.
Okay, yeah, thank you for that. Anyone else want to come in on this question? Yes, Daniel.
Well, yeah, just to build on what Paul was saying about fragmentation of water policy across government, you've also got data centres being looked after by DCIT, you've got green hydrogen being looked after by DESNES, you've got DCMS taking decisions on things like Universal Studios and the leisure industry, and you've got DFT looking after transport schemes and East West Rail. So yeah, getting fragmentation, trying to bring together these interests at a regional scale is really, really important, partly to make up for some of the fragmentation that's happening above us. But just to try to answer the specific question about bringing together water resources management plans, drainage and wastewater management plans, and thinking about how these options, particular investments, might help in the round. Can you address multiple objectives with single investments? Absolutely. And that's what we're trying to do as part of our second round of regional planning. And a great step that's already been taken within Anglian Water, which is for us, the Water Resources East, the water and sewage company for the whole region, that they now have an integrated infrastructure planning team. So the people developing water resources management plan options are the same people who are delivering options for drainage and wastewater management. And for example, some of these synergies are, if you hit hard on things like water efficiency, that results in less wastewater that you then need to treat, and that might allow you for longer to live within your permit conditions. If you put in things like sustainable drainage systems upstream, then you're separating out some of the water that might have ended up in that kind of wastewater stream, and therefore you have kind of benefits for nature and for water recycling. If you open up markets for non-potable reuse, again, that's water that can meet some of the non-wholesome water needs within particular catchments, whilst also allowing water companies to live within their permit conditions. And thinking about where water is abstracted from, to allow the environment to benefit from that water for longer, can you move those abstraction points downstream? And can you think about where treated effluent from wastewater plants is discharged into the environment? Can you move those discharge points upstream? And that means that, again, the rivers benefit from that water for longer. If you've got lots of growth within an area, that means that there is, yes, going to be more water demand, but also more wastewater being discharged. And so if you think about these things in the round as part of a system, some of these kind of opportunities and synergies start to present themselves.
Yeah, thanks very much, Daniel. Maybe one more on this point before we move on? Anyone? Okay. Well, we'll carry on to some of the next questions then, because we do have plenty of them to get through. So another particularly thorny challenge, there's a question from Maddie. It says, how can future water regulation best balance the need for stringent environmental protection, particularly from emerging contaminants such as PFAS, with the energy and carbon costs of advanced treatment technologies? So how do we think future regulation is best going to manage that the increasing cost of treatment and the energy costs of treatment with the need for protection from these emerging contaminants? Who wants to start us off on that? Maybe you, Sebastian, if this is your the subject of your PhD, and then Dan.
Yeah, happy to start off. I think what we need to be able to do is understand a kind of comprehensive, which I don't think we have a real understanding of at the moment, is a real comprehensive of the kind of cost of those kind of treatment technologies, kind of the supply chain, the entire kind of supply chain impacts of kind of increasing certain technologies on a scale based on the kind of emerging pollutants and the kind of testing that we're seeing. We obviously, as part of emerging pollutants, we're understanding that they are also very difficult to treat substances. They're not something that the kind of technology that we have currently in water treatment plants is able to remove quite easily. So it is going to be quite the challenge to try and make that balance. But I think most of the time we need to consider what is the kind of overarching, be it public health and environmental health kind of impacts of performing those kind of treatments, and how do we make sure that is again balanced against cost, which generally will end up potentially on kind of customer bills and so on. So it's going to be a real challenge, but we need to have more robust understanding of what those kind of treatment goals would look like on a cost basis, and is there something that we can then create flexibility in as we see kind of flashes of potential changes to the concentrations of those contaminants in the environment, and maybe not be so prescriptive on designated treatment goals across an entire AMP cycle and so on, and have some kind of flexibility to understand, well, actually, do I want to keep my customer bills low? Do I want to keep the environment healthy and so on? But is that something that we can achieve given the kind of particular or the current circumstances regarding water treatment works, supply chains and so on? So yeah, I think a lot more research and robust data needs to be collated around those treatment costs before we can kind of make a bigger decision on how do we balance those two things.
Thanks, Sebastian. Dan, I think you had your hand up as well.
Yeah, I did. And just like I'd associate myself with Sebastian's comments, but just to build on it, I think UCWIR did a study a couple of years ago and established that it would cost about £21 billion to remove PFAS comprehensively from wastewater, which is obviously an enormous bill. And I think there does need to be a conversation about the sort of risks of PFAS and the benefits of removing it, and some, like I said, trade-offs made in government about what they want. I suppose the Water UK and our members have a simpler message, which is that PFAS, because of the proven risks to human health, we think it should be banned, and an extended producer responsibility scheme introduced to pay for the cleanup. So that would probably mean introducing a quaternary treatment in hotspots, so that's 4-stage treatment, probably granular activated carbon or ozonation, in order to make sure that those issues can be tackled. But I agree with Sebastian that there does need to be a reasoned conversation about what levels of PFAS in the environment we are willing to bear. Like I said, it is removed comprehensively, thankfully, from drinking water, but that will become a more costly procedure over time as well, as I said previously. So yeah, certainly a conversation that needs to be had. But the water sector, we are clear that a ban is the best option for the moment because there are alternatives available.
And with your recommendation around extended producer responsibility, you're echoing the approach of the new European Urban Wastewater Treatment Directive. So whether that will make its way here. So yeah, sorry, Sebastian, you wanted to follow up on that?
I was just going to make one more kind of comment on it. Is what we also need to think about is when we're undertaking, like, removal is different. Like, removal from water is different to removal from the environment, removal from the kind of system that we sit in. So really, we need to have that understanding as well of what does destruction technology, how do we actually take it from the compounds as it is, remove it from the environment, remove it from water, but then not reintroduce that through disposal methods and things like this, which again is going to, as we understand that further, that's going to probably again increase that kind of treatment cost and actually the removal cost from the system, and kind of pathways to kind of human health issues and so on. So it's not just thinking about the removal from the environment, but being able to remove it as a compound from the system itself.
Yeah, exactly. And at what point do we remove it as well? I think there's an interesting question to be had about whether upstream measures are more effective than end of pipe removal as well. But I'm going to move us on, if that's okay, because we want to make sure we get through as many questions as possible. But just again, following up on some of the comments that have been made previously, and there's been a few questions in the chat about this. Where do you see the regulations going, or what would you like to see from the regulations, the change in regulations around the emergence of water reuse and water recycling, both for drinking water at large scales and for the small scale, non-potable, decentralized building scale, that type of thing. So what do we think is needed for enabling that to happen? Who wants to start with that one? No one.
Shall
Okay.
I?
All right, Paul.
Have a go. So I think it's again whether or not you need regulation, or where does regulation sit within this, and what's the societal discussion around this? Because it's not that it's the regulators don't want to do it. Regulation follows policy. Policy follows society. That's the sort of the flow of thinking that we have here. So for me, this is not a regulatory issue. This is a societal issue, and society doesn't want desalination. It doesn't want water reuse, and it doesn't want water recycling. It doesn't want, interestingly, you would be hard put to take the discharge from a wastewater treatment plant and discharge that directly into a reservoir. You could take the discharge from a wastewater treatment plant, discharge it 500 meters upstream into a stream which feeds into the reservoir, and that's okay. So there's behavioral issues and societal issues that need to come into this discussion as well before we ever talk about, and then what's an appropriate regulatory approach. I think the regulatory approaches are just a technical assessment of what you're then going to do. This is much more, how do you get society to accept that this is a good approach?
Well, certainly something that is of keen interest to me. You and I may need to have another discussion about whether society is prepared for this or not, because I may have a slightly different view to you. But that aside, Mark, I think you had your hand up as well. Did you want to, what's the farmer's perspective on this?
Yeah, I mean, first from a positive perspective, one of the
Mark, yeah, there we go.
Hello. One of the really positive aspects of things like effluent reuse, for example, is it is a reliable source of water, particularly when you're looking at peak periods in summer, for example, where abstraction is very limited. It is a reliable source of water that can be depended on in order to irrigate it when crops need it. So that's a really positive side of it. The challenge is that the way the system is set up at the moment, regulation, that it is requiring of what would be a small or medium business to undertake the same exercises that a water company would do in terms of testing, in terms of having trained staff, etc., in order to apply that for irrigation, that mean that it's prohibitive. So if you want it to go forward and to be reused by that sort of organisation, that small business, or where it has practical benefits, then the system needs to be set up so that they can actually access it, because at the moment it's not geared for that. So simplifying, making it more straightforward. Where can we cooperate with water companies in terms of testing for what the quality is of the effluent that's being reused? All of those aspects need to be considered if they want it to happen, but it has real positive benefits if it can be done.
Great, thank you.
Just to come back, because there is a regulatory aspect to this, certainly for effluent which is going to be used for irrigation, and I see that potentially there could be a lot more effluent used for irrigation purposes than currently happens, especially on sports fields and golf courses and those sorts of things. One of the regulatory barriers to that is that if you're then going to use the effluent for that purpose, you would need a waste management license to do that. And so there needs to be a discussion about, does that actually need a waste management license? And then that is a regulatory barrier to that, which does need to be addressed. Just from experience, and this goes way back to when I was at school in Cyprus, the playing fields on the forces bases, all of those playing fields were irrigated by effluent way back in the 60s. So this is a technology that's used in other places and without issue. And I think, yeah, that bit particularly needs to be used. However, there will be, for those of us who remember the safe sludge matrix and the development of that, there would be a question, I think, for the application of some treated effluents onto salad crops, for example. Is that an acceptable use or not? And then we come back to the conversation you and I need to have, Heather, around society.
Yes, thanks for that. Well, certainly, if I'm not mistaken, Cyprus recycles 100% of its wastewater, as does Malta, and there are a few European countries that practice that quite extensively, usually for agricultural or non-drinking purposes.
But the interesting bit about that Cypriot bit was that was on the sovereign base area, and therefore came under a UK regulatory regime, not the Cypriot one, and predates the Cypriot one.
Okay, thanks for that, Paul. Maybe one more comment on this one, Joanna, before we move on to the next.
Yeah, I suppose, from a psychological perspective, touching on is the society ready for it or not? Society may not be ready for many things, but it certainly won't be ready for things that it hasn't seen and are all purely theoretical and impossible to implement. So I think maybe those two things have to be looked at in parallel. If it is too difficult for test cases and using, in the country here rather than somewhere else in the world, if it's impossible to show and demonstrate that nothing terrible happens, the society may continue to sort of protest and say, no, we don't want this. But realistically, does society want water shortages? Probably not. And so, if there are technological options and if there is a kind of scientific consensus that something is safe, then I think those two things should go in parallel. There could be big campaigns in terms of changing public opinion, but I genuinely think until you can see something with your own eyes and be shown that it can work, humans are resistant to change. And certainly it can be very difficult to perceive something that is a theoretical solution. So I wouldn't wait for the society to start demanding water reuse. I think we need to show it to them in sort of constrained pilot cases.
Yeah, thanks, Joanna. I think you'll find that there are plans to do exactly that, and we're awaiting a new national campaign, communications campaign about water efficiency, which will hopefully touch on this. So it's a great point. I think Pete's going to take us on to the next question.
Yeah, so with I can see there's some really interesting chat going on the chat in relation to water trading, in relation to how you transport potentially unwholesome water around in terms of distribution networks. So we might come back to those. But in terms of the next question, it's kind of something that's been touched upon by some of the speakers, but it's around some of the, I suppose, the conflicting regulation policy out there. So the question is it feasible to meet the growing demand for water and the resilience in supply of water, whilst also achieving environmental targets such as reducing abstraction under the WIRE kind of regulations and policies? So how do we resolve that, and how do we get better, I suppose, joined up thinking around that? So would anybody like to tackle that one? They've kind of made a subset point. Is desalination the answer? Is that the golden bullet? But maybe that will come into your answer. But Daniel, Johns, go first.
Yeah, well, no, it is. So that's exactly what our regional plan does, is it shows that you can meet the growing needs of the population. You can have the highest environmental ambition for returning water and reducing abstraction. You can have greater climate resilience and greater resilience in the public water supply. So, but it does, at least in the east of England, mean you do need to go down a path toward things like advanced water recycling and desalination, which are options that you wouldn't necessarily prefer. They wouldn't be the options first on your list because they are more expensive, they're more carbon intensive, and they have their own environmental consequences that need to be carefully managed. But there is a limit to how much water you can abstract from the environment, and and desal therefore has to be a kind of growing part of the story. And in broad terms, if there is a trade-off, obviously the more desal you have, or rather the more growth you have, the more desal you need, and therefore also the greater the costs in terms of affordability of water bills. So there is a simple kind of relationship there. But there is only so far that you can go with things like water efficiency. We're maxing out essentially on kind of leakage performance within the east of England. We're already rolling out smart metering by 2035. We're already obviously hoping the new national campaign, I think, Heather, you're just referring to, will be launched later this month. So this is a new kind of national water saving campaign led by government with the water companies, with regulators and others, local councils, supporting that. So there's only so far you can go in parts of the east. But I say there are other innovative options which are starting to test. So, for example, better real-time and dynamic management of water within catchments. So at the moment, the abstraction regime works on daily, monthly, if not yearly, kind of license caps and restrictions. But as Mark says, if the water is available within the catchment, which could be mid-July, could be mid-August, I'm sitting here in South London and it's tipping down outside. Why not allow water companies? Why not allow abstractors, farmers, to be able to take that water when it is available? And the way to do that is to have smart real-time telemetry on pumps, river gauges, and that's exactly what we're doing within the Upper Cam. So working with the Environment Agency, funded by DEFRA and MHCLG, putting in a lot of telemetry across the catchment and showing in real time that there is wins for the environment by making sure water abstraction is restricted as quickly as it can be, but also wins for agriculture by being able to continue to abstract for longer. And it's through those kinds of approaches that I think there is those kind of win-wins where we can at least try to make best use of the water that is available before we go down the path towards kind of advanced water recycling and desal.
Great, thank you very much. I think Dan Walker-Nolan also had his hand up.
Yeah, I mean, I just wanted to, Daniel kind of stole my thunder, but this idea of dynamic abstraction and making sure that we have abstraction that can sort of benefit the environment. Also, I think there's some of these sort of like environmental rules, they are a bit too rigid. So I'll give you an example. One part of EA might ask a water company to reduce sort of groundwater abstraction because it's got flow targets as part of good ecological status. But then another part of EA might then call the company and say, well, actually, you reducing this groundwater abstraction has caused groundwater flooding in the winter, so can you turn that back on? And there are often quite mixed messages that are given to the industry about what to do in these circumstances. So I think a little bit more sort of a common sense approach, dynamic abstraction, having much better data in the environment. A lot of the abstraction reductions are based on very high level modeling, which actually isn't borne out by reality, would be really sensible. I mean, there's a bigger conversation here, probably we won't get into it right now, but about sort of good ecological status and Water Framework Directive regulations and the behaviours that they drive, and whether those environmental targets need to be replaced with ones that can be more flexed to individual circumstances in catchments, regions, etc., which I think is a conversation worth having, and one we probably haven't really got to the nub of yet.
Thank you, Dan. Any other? Yeah, Paul.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, I think we also need to make sure that we use the right type of water for the right purpose. So we're using drinking quality water for uses that don't require it. And you see good moves in this. Sizewell C, for their construction, is putting it in a desal plant. Nobody will object to a desal plant for that purpose. Desal can go for hydrogen production. So, you know, if we get the proper mix right, I think we can make a lot of moves into the right and address growth and the need of water. I do think, though, that we are also going to have to think about whether or not in certain locations we need more advanced wastewater treatment plant technologies to be able to achieve the permits or to achieve the discharge limits that the receiving environment requires. And so we're going to have new technologies which might increase the unit cost, but that's the price. And if you do an economic appraisal at the right level, you can make the business case for that. But we are going to have to do that sort of thing.
Thank you, Paul. Any other final comments on that particular question? No? Okay.
Yeah. So
over to that.
Thanks. I'm going to pick up on a question from Nikki, where she asks, where do we think that the industry might need some more certainty, long-term certainty? So we've picked up on the need for some flexibility, so the need to adapt to emerging demands and whatnot. But there are certain areas where in planning long-term infrastructure, we may need more certainty around the ability to secure land, secure supply chain commitments, secure investments. So where, in your view, do you think that certainty is needed? Who wants to pick up on that one? All right, Daniel.
I'll go back to the kind of review and the Environment Act, and I suppose just looking ahead beyond 2027 and the Water Framework Directive target to bring rivers back into good ecological status, we know that that's never going to happen in practice. There's no way that we can get from like 20% of rivers in good ecological status in our region to 75% in just a short couple of years. So beyond 2027, what is it? What is it that we're trying to achieve with the water environment? You know, how clean, how pristine, how greater flows. There is no target, there is no apex target for the water environment that's going to drive action beyond 2027. And it's something that Cunliffe said that needs to be done. To be honest, I think it's probably a question that he ducked because it was part of his terms of reference. And I know it's something that DEFRA are trying to figure out now. But until we have some clarity beyond 2027, what does a good plan look like? What is it trying to achieve? How do we make these trade-offs and decisions between affordability, environmental targets, resilience, and everything else? Unless we have some kind of governing target as part of a new national water strategy, then we're kind of having to make trade-offs based on our own kind of perceptions and subjective criteria, when actually this is something that we should agree on almost as a country.
Great, thanks. Yeah, Dan.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think in the environmental space, that's a very, very important matter. I mean, so I think resilience standards as well, again, as referenced by Cunliffe, are very, very important to set a long-term direction and expectation on the industry. So one of the things that's been very, very transformative, certainly for water resource planning, is the 1 in 500-year drought standard. And I think something similar, so probably statutory backed standards on things like how many customers are sort of exposed to a single source of supply. So if that one source goes off, there's no resilience. How much capacity should companies have to pump for peak demand, which is becoming more of an issue in certain parts of the country. Certainly, if you switched on the news in the last couple of months, you'd have seen a few incidents where the water just couldn't be pumped quickly enough, and climate change is going to accelerate those sort of problems because the temperature is going to get hotter in the summer and it's going to be drier. So having standards to cover those sort of things, which can be kind of introduced with no expectation that they would necessarily be kind of met 100% initially, but could be aspired to over time, would be really, really sensible and help the companies to understand what needs to happen with their assets in terms of connectivity, health, and making sure that they are in ongoing good working order, and making sure that they have sufficient capacity in the system to serve customers potable water and to provide wastewater services, which is obviously what they're here to do.
Thank you. Any other thoughts on this particular point? Yeah, Sebastian? Yes. Oh, sorry, Sebastian first, then Paul.
I was going to slightly touch on a slightly different, on the list of things that you were talking about. And I think one thing that we need to think about is that supply chain aspect, is the kind of human capacity, resources, the skills resources as well, that as a nation we continually tend to lack on, and is something that maybe through kind of increasing the interest of kind of being part of the water as an entire sector, not just within the businesses, the water companies themselves, but those other kind of supply chain aspects that support those businesses, and how do we keep people and those skills kind of going. And I think that's going to again be part of that certainty that is required to make these longer 25-year plans that are being talked about, because if we see that that's not something that's achievable with that human capacity, then how are we really going to manage it? It's great to have these concepts around regulation, but if we physically cannot build the things, what are we regulating? So yeah, that I think is a very important aspect of that certainty.
Thanks, Sebastian. Yeah, how do we make sure we have enough people with the right skills to deliver these ambitious plans? Paul, you wanted to have one last comment on this?
Yeah, just building on what Daniel's saying, I think it's really key, which is we don't have we haven't had a sort of major water strategy for a while, and we have the opportunity through the Water Bill, Coming Water Act, to really think about what the apex targets and the supporting targets should look like for the water environment in, say, 2050. And then do the current EIP targets around water support delivery against that, because there is a mismatch between the headline 2027 achievement target for Water Framework Directive regulations and those longer term targets which are sat within the EIP. If you deliver the EIP targets, you won't deliver the 75 or 77% or whatever the agreed number is by 2027. So having a good articulation of that everybody then can buy into and is working towards, I think would be really helpful.
Yeah, so at the very least, some certainty around the targets that we're trying to achieve, the long-term targets that we're trying to achieve. Great. Okay, thanks. I think we'll move us on to the next question, Pete.
Yeah, I think we're going to have two final questions to go round. So I'll start with the first one, and then Heather's going to finish off. And this point is, I guess, it's something that's been touched upon, but it'd be good to have a little bit further clarity. And it's around having more joined up policy frameworks across all governmental departments in terms of housing, infrastructure, agriculture, you're laughing, economic growth, and it's just making sure that all of those things have the questioner calls it a water lens, which I think is sort of a nice way of putting it. And so how far do you think we are on that journey, and what more do you think we have to do to get there? So maybe give us a mark out of 10 how well you think we're doing and how we can progress. Who wants to start? Paul and Dan, I guess this is perhaps starters for you, but then we can see who else wants to answer.
Okay, yeah, it's a real challenge, isn't it? Because what you essentially have to do is ensure that various secretaries of state see this as being of sufficient importance that they're going to work across the piece. And that is a real challenge for anybody who's worked close to government. I've been working on water and water-related issues since 1974. Do I see any greater integration now than I did in 1974?
Understood. Okay, Dan, do you want to give your perspective on that? Dan Walker-Nolan.
Yeah, I mean, having worked in government myself, I certainly understand what Paul's saying. I mean, there have been some steps towards more integrated working. So, for example, through the Water Delivery Task Force, which is DEFRA-led, but includes ministers from MHCLG, from DSIT, and officials from all over government, so HMT, DESNES, etc. So that's a lot of acronyms for people who don't know UK government departments, by the way. But you know, it's departments working together to make sure that blockers for water infrastructure can be tackled in a timely manner, certainly throughout the current asset management period between now and 2030. And there have been some successes. So that group has worked together to unblock housing constraints in Sussex North and get 21,000 houses unblocked because there were issues around water neutrality, which is a policy that was introduced by Natural England. However, having said that, that's the optimistic, positive bit. I think that if you are looking at every department really pulling its weight, and for example, highways, so, you know, DFT and ministers really leaning into this and saying, look, we're fully on board with water sector objectives and we are going to reduce highways runoff, etc. You are going to need those regional systems planners to do a lot of work, and you're going to need a lot of departments to accept what would possibly be seen as impinging on their autonomy. And that is a matter for government, and to make sure that, you know, that water has been a doorstep issue, I think it's fair to say, for a number of years now. And there needs to be some bravery there around taking a more cross-government position.
Thank
So,
you.
Pete, if I can just come back to be maybe slightly more positive. So I think the Cambridge Water Scarcity Group has actually, you know, like North Sussex, Cambridge Water Scarcity Group working together across MHCLG and DEFRA, working with the Environment Agency and with the water companies, has unlocked development that was previously blocked. And that's a good thing. The challenge, though, is that water resource legislation sits in one group within DEFRA, water quality sits in a different group, and flood risk management sits in another group, and then we've got spatial planning sat over somewhere else. So this is really challenging about how that works together. Now, the challenge is, and I think this isn't just for water, but is more generally, the answer seems to be the regional groups. So the regional groups, why should the regional groups be able to join together policy areas that the national groups don't appear to be able to join together? So why, as soon as you get to a geography, are those people being tasked with tasks that at a higher level aren't joined up? And you just see it, for example, if you were going to discuss a particular topic. You know, I remember when I was an environment manager within the pharmaceutical industry and the oil industry, and you would be the environmental manager, and you were supposed to understand a broad range of environmental issues, and then you would talk to the different regulators about it, and they would bring in 6 or 7 people. And you would be going, yeah, but why do we need to talk to 6 or 7 people if I'm supposed to be the person who then comes up with a single integrated answer? Why can't, on the other side of the conversation, be somebody who is equally tasked with coming up with a single integrated ask. So how do we get at the right levels within these discussions an integrated ask which can come up with an integrated solution for then integrated delivery?
Thank you, Paul. Yes, kind of a real wicked problem in this one, isn't it? I think.
It is.
Okay.
Can I, sorry, just come in slightly provocatively?
Yeah, go
advocate
for
the
it.
devil.
Yeah.
Will things improve if we have an integrated water regulator, or will it just create new silos between water regulation and environmental regulation and land management and all these other challenges? I think, you know, it's one of those things that it was easy for the Independent Water Commission to say. It's much more difficult to figure out exactly how that might work in a way that retains, you know, the relationship between you know, sustainable land management with water quality and water resources, given they're so really very important. The fact that flood risk management policy will remain with the Environment Agency, when actually water resources and flood risk management are two sides of the same coin. And so we're at risk, I think, not only in the complication and the costs and potentially disruption to regulatory processes in creating a new integrated water regulator, but actually I'm not sure it's necessarily the right answer in the first place.
Yeah, good points. I think we'll probably leave it there unless anyone else has got any desperate short final comments. No, I think we're done. Okay, we'll pass over to Heather.
Well, I think you'll find, Daniel, that has will lead us very nicely onto our final question, which is in fact about that the new integrated regulator. And just before we come on to that, I just wanted to say thank you to everybody who has put questions in the chat. We've seen some really interesting questions. We could have picked any of them to talk about, so apologies if we didn't get to your question, but they were all extremely interesting, and we would have been able to talk at length about any of them. So I hope some of that discussion will continue after the event ends. But to come back to this idea of the regulator, we know there are plans now to create this new integrated regulator. I think it was yourself, Daniel, who had a slide that showed the different components that it was bringing together. Ofwat, the DWI, the water parts of Natural England, and some of the water parts of the Environment Agency, although that last part's probably one of the most nebulous to figure out. And so bringing them together into this joint body. So I guess the final question is just to reflect and follows very nicely on from your previous comment. What do we want from that regulator? Yes, I take your point, Daniel, about the risks that we're simply, you know, whether it's the right answer to begin with, but given that that's the direction of travel, what would we ideally like to see from that regulator in terms of its remit, in terms of its relationship with the water companies, with the regional water authorities, with other stakeholders in the water sector, and what's our kind of top wish list for what we hope that regulator will achieve. So we'll hopefully go through everybody on this last question. But who would like to start? Yeah, Dan.
Nice and
straight in there.
Nice and concise if you can, so we can get round everyone.
Yeah, no, of course. So there's three things, and look, I hope the first one, you know, able to give a single answer on issues and not endlessly relitigate things as we sometimes get between Ofwat and the EA. So that's the first thing. Treat companies individually and make sure that they can use enhanced discretion, constrained discretion to ensure that their considerations are tailored towards companies and that they are taking into account individual different circumstances in individual areas. And then the third thing, I suppose, is that it needs to provide a stable framework and an investable framework to make sure that, you know, we get the massive investment that we need in, you know, water infrastructure. So this asset management period is 104 billion. The next one might be even more, depending on how the policy shakes down. So a stable framework is very much needed to get the investment in to make the system better for customers and the environment. Great,
thank you. Others? I mean, maybe we'll come to you last, Daniel, since you've made that previous comment. But what about Joanna or Sebastian, the student perspective on this? What do you guys think about the new regulator?
Yeah, look, I mean, there is absolutely no guarantee that a single organization doesn't have silos, the same way that different organizations do. But realistically, I think there is hope that if you bring people into a single organization, at least you limit the number of different systems they are using. So there is at least a possibility of sharing information within a single organization. It's sometimes, when organizations merge, the most painful process of any merger is the fact that there is hundreds of different IT systems, and the fact that there is no single source of truth to questions. So hopefully, eventually, that new regulator has that single source of truth. The concept of the whole firm view, surely that is a good thing for a water company. Being able to deal with a regulator who understands that entire firm and all the aspects of the regulation, rather than having to go to however many different contacts and fill in different plans with overlapping remits, as we said. So yeah, I personally think the single regulator has potential to improve things, but everything depends on the implementation. So
yeah. Proof is in the pudding, as it were.
It is.
Thanks, Joanna. Sebastian, do you want to comment on that?
I mean, I'd probably just echo the kind of similar points around, the hope would be that we're not getting conflicting kind of, regulations coming in. One thing that I would often deal with when working in the water utilities was exactly the kind of constraints between increased demand versus a capped license, and you would expect that those two bodies would hopefully have a conversation to understand whether this is the best thing to do. We would constantly be having to kind of push back on those things to understand, and having overriding public interest, and you would have thought that would be understood prior to those regulations coming into place by the bodies that understand this. So that's the kind of hope, is that's what kind of is, but one of the big outcomes is that we're not having to constantly back and forth, because there hasn't probably been the most holistic conversation before it's been brought forward to the water company.
Yeah. Great. Mark, what about you? What do you think the agricultural sector would hope for from the new regulator?
Well, I think the aim would be that the new regulator is an enabler of the new sort of regional planning process, rather than one that potentially might gum up the works. The challenge is, for example, at the moment, that we like to be able to talk to those people who are making decisions on the ground, local area teams, in terms of access to water, just to get initial views on things. And if we have to go through a centralized process, that slows it down, it adds cost to the process. Where can we overcome some of these things? And if the new regulator increasingly sort of centralizes the process, that's not going to help. So it needs to be enabling of the regional systems planning element of it, rather than being one that's going to actually stop us from making these decisions quickly and efficiently.
Great, thank you. Paul, what's your wish list?
Well, I take Daniel's concerns about this, but just some other observations. I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? Because the regulations are often written by the policymakers, not by the people who are going to be implementing the regulations. And therefore, we wish the regulators would do. I think it's making sure that we're asking the right questions of the right people in this process. So is this a fault in the implementation of the regulations, or is this a fault and a flaw within the regulations themselves? And those are questions to two different parties. And we need to be clear about who we're asking, who's able to ask that. I think there's going to be really challenging internal discussions within the regulators. Joanna was saying, the different views which are currently expressed in the different organizations will still be expressed within the single organization. And that it's whether or not, it's how that organization addresses those internal tensions. And then is it going to be possible for who does the farmer talk to who understands that, or who does the individual business talk to? And do they have to talk to multiple people within that regulator? And as Daniel says, there's going to be interesting new interfaces created between existing Natural England and existing Environment Agency teams that don't move across and those that have moved across? And how are those new boundaries and new interfaces working in practice? And one of the issues I've found through practice is that vertical silos, if you address vertical silos, one of the challenges can be that all you do is transfer those into horizontal pipes, which are no more permeable than the silos were. They're just different groupings. And after a while, you get new challenges that have to be addressed. So I hope that all of this can be worked through, that there is clarity in how this is going to work in practice, and how the governance works. So is it going to be a statutory framework, the regional plan, for example? And if you have a regional water plan, which is statutory, how does that interface with a water company plan and a water company statutory water resource management plan? And what's the interface between those regional planners and the board of the water company? And what's the relative roles and responsibilities sat within that? So I think there's quite a lot to be worked on, which I think is one of the reasons why there's a lot of thinking still going on within DEFRA as to how this works out in practice.
Great, yeah, thank you. And finally, Daniel,
Hey.
is there anything that might change your mind in your view about whether the new regulator is the right approach or not?
Well, I think to focus on the benefits, because I'm a huge fan of integrated regulation. I'm just not convinced that the answer is therefore an integrated regulator for the water sector. That absolutely there will be benefits by bringing together the economic regulation of the sector with the environmental regulation of the sector. Absolutely bring together those teams so that you do get a single answer from the regulator when it comes to investment planning. I think in the past that we've certainly seen Ofwat and Environment Agency have different statuses, different powers within the system. What the Environment Agency giveth, often Ofwat then taketh away. And therefore bringing those teams together definitely would bring benefits, but there are means to do that. For example, through the RAPID process, overseeing strategic resource options, I think has worked really well, and they're consulting now on extending their remit into water recycling and beyond. I think there's also a benefit from bringing Drinking Water Inspectorate closer into the fold and working particularly closely with the Environment Agency and Ofwat. Heather, have you said many times, it's really challenging for the DWI to be thinking about non-wholesome water standards and opening up non-potable water reuse, that it just does not compute, it doesn't fit within the model of the Drinking Water Inspectorate, which is too focused, I would say, on public health and risk adversity, that actually maybe given the importance of opening up non-potable reuse to water resources in the way that we've all talked about this afternoon, you do need to kind of, just blur the boundaries, I suppose, between the DWI as it currently stands and the Environment Agency from a kind of national framework perspective. So absolutely integrated regulation focused on achieving outcomes through constrained discretion, appointing a lead regulator for particular projects, which is already part of the core review, part of being implemented, but not necessarily equals to a single water regulator for the sector.
Okay. Well, yes, lots of potential benefits there, but a lot to still be worked out in practice. I think that's very clear. So we're nearly out of time. So I just want to thank all of our panel for giving some really enlightening discussion there, and hopefully some discussion that can be carried on throughout as we move towards the new legislation and the new regulator and all of that fun stuff. So I think we had some very interesting discussion today. I really want to thank again the participants in the audience who put questions in the chat, and I hope you'll carry on some of that thinking as well. So I'll just hand over to Pete for the final word.
Great. Thanks, Heather. Yeah, just really to reiterate what Heather said. Yeah, thank you to all of the panelists, the speakers, the questions, the audience for the involvement. We could have had this sort of 2 times over in terms of the conversation. So I think this might be a topic that we can perhaps revisit in a few years, perhaps when the new regulatory environment has been cemented a little bit further. So certainly more to discuss. So yes, thank you all very much, and thank you very much to our studio here for putting this event on, which is run seamlessly. So yes, we'll finish up there. The recording of the session will be made available to everyone who's attended. So if you've missed anything, we'll look at providing the transcript of the chat as well, so you can see the questions and comments that have come through. But other than that, please do make sure to follow the CDT WIRe program on LinkedIn, which we provided the QR code, that's the word, which is up there, so you can follow us, see what our students are up to. Thank you to our student panelists as well, who it's quite nerve-wracking to do some of this, so really appreciate their contribution. But other than that, thank you very much for your time this afternoon. We will let you get back to finishing off your working day. So thank you.